Embodied. So in terms of the canon, in terms of the text that we use as references, can you give us any recommendations for what you would suggest we go away and look up and have a nose around to challenge what we've become so used to?
Well, I'm not very good at lists, and in fact, I'm not in favor of compiling lists of works. I think people should read widely, and part of the reason why I don't do that, or don't like to do that, is the reason you've mentioned, that you have texts which become, canonized. People tend to think that these are the only texts you can read on a subject. And the question for me is not whether a text is a canon or not, but when and how did it become one? Those are the kind of questions that interest me. I don't believe any text is a canon. I'm more interested in how did it become a canon, and who stood to gain from that, and what were the processes which produced that canonization. And those are the, I think, more important questions to ask. And when you read, you find a lot of things. You discover that many of the texts we now consider to be canons were never. At some point they were even considered heretical texts, or texts on the margin that nobody was allowed to read. But then they became somehow canonized through the politics of empire and many other factors, not just reduced to the politics of empire, because there were many texts which were even against the official theology of the state, and yet they became, canonized later on. Now, it depends on the subject. When it comes to topics, if it is, in the field of Islamic law, there are a lot of texts to read, and I would say, as I said in my presentation, I think the greatest contribution has come from Islamic feminists on the subject. Now, in terms of methodology as well, not just in terms of what is being said, but also in terms of method and analysis has come. So any text in that field that is looking, whether it is in the field of the Quran, or rather Quranic exegesis or law, will be a good place to start. And then you can apply some of these methods in other areas. There's a book recently published called Men in Charge, right? That by a group of female Muslim scholars. It is doing exactly the kind of gender analysis that is needed in reading early sources. The kind of analysis that didn't happen in the past. Although there are traces of that. You see those traces from women we study, that they were challenging some of the patriarchal interpretations of sources. They were openly challenging those, and you can see some of those mentioned in the footnotes, but you don't see them as recorded. You don't see them recorded as volumes or texts for many reasons. So I think I would read that, and also works by, I think many of the scholars you're already familiar with. Amina Wadud is one of them. Ziba Mir Hussein has done some work, and Farid Ishaq in South Africa has done an important work on the Quran, liberation and pluralism, which is the only, in my view, the only text that engages with the question of liberation, or reading text from the point of view of liberation, because he lived that experience. So he knows what he's writing about. And he's not engaging in metaphysical theorization. He is writing about something he experienced. Many people, saw people dying, and people were arrested, people were exiled, and almost everyone lost someone in the family, fighting the white supremacy in various parts of Africa. So when they engage with these religious texts as Christians or as Muslims, they are doing so from the, they're drawing on their experiences. Christians did that. They produced liberation theology, black theology of liberation, and Muslims did the same in Southern Africa. There's also Islamic liberation theology. I'm not talking about the stuff that some people have been doing nowadays. I don't know, some decolonizing, whatever it is. I'm talking about Muslim, right? I'm talking about the early writings on the subject where people were drawing on their experience. They were not, they were forced into that situation where they had to, because they were committed Muslims, and they were reading in the Quran verses which were challenging them. Well, if you're reading a verse telling you that don't take non-Muslims as friends, when the reality is that you need them in order to confront and defeat an oppressive system, what do? Right. So you can't say, well, I'm going to just stick to my faith and live under an oppressive system. So people were making those choices. But they were making those choices because they were not directly affected by oppression. So those are people who were living in the nice areas who didn't have to deal with police brutality and violence, children being shot, on the mass killings by the state. So they didn't have to deal with that. So they could engage they had the luxury to stick to traditionalist interpretations because, their lives were not in danger. But those whose lives were in danger, whose children were being killed, if they were Christians, if they were Muslims, they couldn't read the Bible, the theology of turning the other cheek, or, that if someone's steal your socks, you give them your shoes too. It doesn't make sense. So they had to find readings of the Bible which spoke to their experiences as people on the margins. And also, given that a system like the apartheid system was a Christian fundamentalist system, maybe people don't know this. It was defended on the basis of the Bible, biblical interpretations of the Dutch Reformed Church. And the Dutch Reformed Church was expelled from the World Alliance of Churches because its interpretation of the Bible was seen as a violation of Christian principles. It was expelled. So the official religion of the state in South Africa was the Dutch Reformed Church. So it sanctioned racist interpretations of Genesis in order to advance the system of apartheid. So you had Christians who had to deal with that. They also read the Bible, but they had to read it from the point of view of the oppressed. So my reading of the Quran and yours as a woman are different. I'm reading from the point of view of privilege as a privileged male, and you are reading it from the point of view of a woman. That is exactly what was happening. So you had on one hand, it was as though there was a God for the oppressor and a God for the oppressed. And you were just waiting to see which God is going to win this battle. Right. So the interpretations done by black Christians was done from the point of view of the oppressed. So when they are reading the Bible, because the Bible is written, from the point of view of the empire, right, of the Roman Empire, of the Greeks, and so they are reading it from a different point of view. They are reading it from the point of view of the people in the margins. People were excluded. So they came to different conclusions. So the reading of Desmond Tutu's reading of Genesis was different from the theologians in the Dutch Reformed Church. And Alan Bossak's reading was different from the others. So while people on Sunday, the police officers who were charged and the military charged with killing black children in South Africa, they went to church on Sunday, and after that they would go and wear uniforms and go and commit their atrocities. And at the same time, Desmond Tutu went to church, and after that went on the march. And so you had these different views. So Muslims were also not immune to these kind of discussions. You were also very much aware that you were reading a text which centers justice. And you were told by preachers that Islam is the religion of justice, and yet you didn't see that characterized in the lives of the Muslims you were living with. In fact, you had Muslims who were collaborating with the apartheid system for financial reasons, breaking the sanctions and doing all sorts of things to be closer to the government. So the readings were different of the Quran. You had the same Quran, but you had different readings of it, and I think that's why for me and many others. Our reading, if I read a text written by Farid Ishaq, I know where he's coming from. I lived that life. But then you read reviews of his works. There's a review online done by someone in Cambridge, a white privileged scholar who never lived under racism. So it's a critique of the text. Because, well, I don't bother about that kind of review because I understand, well, he has never had to live in this kind of experience, so he can't understand why this kind of theology was developing. And a theology which is not informed by lived realities is not even theology, it's just...
And thinking about what you've just said about understanding different realities, and you talked about the difference in privilege between yourself and myself, but there are many ways in which I am privileged and privileged over you, racially, and also considering the global community that we belong to. I'm very privileged to be living in England and having a lot of freedom that I have, the money that I earn, the stability of a home, that kind of stuff. What questions do I and people like me need to be asking as we approach these different lived realities and try to place ourselves within that and our vantage point within that?
Yeah, I think this is where ideas like intersectionality become important.
Could you give the word
yes,
down?
that systems of oppression are, there are people who experience oppression at different levels. And intersectionality is not about rather identities, people having different identities. It's about how oppressive systems operate and how they target people, or how different people experience these systems of oppression. So you, as a woman, you experience systems of oppression, patriarchy, but if you are a white woman, you don't experience white supremacy. But at the same time, patriarchy and white supremacy are two sides of the same coin. And then if you're a black woman, your experiences are different from those of a white feminist. You're a black feminist and your experiences are different. And I'm a male. Yes, I may benefit from patriarchy, but what kind of patriarchy am I benefiting from if it is also linked to white supremacy? So these are the kind of questions that people have to ask and to see how these mechanisms of oppression operate. And I think it's not just a question of asking, but also a question of how you resist that and how you challenge that. And also, and this is why listening is very important, and not try to plug yourself into people's, methods of, people's lives and experiences. Yes, you can attend an event with black people, for example, because you want to listen and understand how they experience resistance, but you shouldn't think that because you also come from a particular marginalized or even oppressed community, you can understand their experience, because there are different ways in which systems of oppression operate.
And what does that mean when we start to relate to each other, or we start to understand each other and each other's experiences, and we understand the different questions that you talked about? How do we use that to understand Allah?
That's a good question, and this is where I think theology in general, whether it's Christian or Muslim theology, is failing. It's of no relevance to many people's lives today, because it fails to address and ask these questions. It's more interested in attributes of God and things like that, and obscure topics that only a small group of people really bother about. And people's experiences here and now, the theologies we have inherited do not address that. They address the lived realities of people in the past, but not ours. I don't think that kind of theology has been developed yet. that addresses these things. I'm talking about the sort of so-called Muslim theologies, because and even Christian theologies. But yes, there have been theologies which developed. I mentioned a good example is Black theology, which developed in America and Africa, and also liberation theology from Latin America and then South Africa and America, and also feminist theology. And all these theologies were developed in order to ask and answer these questions. So if anyone is interested in theology, really that's the only place I would advise people to go to look at theological responses to these questions. These questions have been answered already, but they've been answered in theologies that people don't read or don't engage with, they don't study. And even liberation theology, which developed within the Catholic context, we know that they were persecuted by the Catholic Church. Some people even lost their lives. And the Pope had to apologize recently, the new Pope, to the way that the Catholic Church treated liberation theologians in Latin America. In Africa, we didn't have that problem, but we know that because, we were on the margins, and so I don't think people cared much what the Vatican or Al-Azhar thought, right? They were more worried about defeating a very powerful and oppressive system. And also because, and because established theologies tend to be on the side of the oppressor anyway, and that is one thing. So I think the place to look for real theology is often on the margins there, and you'll find things that you won't find in so-called mainstream theologies.
And we've been talking a lot about quite heavy themes, which is important, but a big part of today is looking at creativity and joy and forms of resistance that don't necessarily look like resistance. And one thing that slightly concerns me with kind of the approach that we've got for today is how easily it is for people to trivialize it and to say, especially in today's modern world where we have terms like sensitive snowflake to describe people who are trying to be more empathetic. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the experiences of resistance that you've had and where you have seen creativity and joy within those.
Yes, right. There's a documentary called A Revolution in Four-Part Harmony. A Revolution in Four-Part Harmony. I come from a tradition where entertainment is an important part of resistance. Now, if you want to understand what I mean by that, you should watch that documentary. It's on YouTube, which is documenting the role that the arts, music, entertainment played in defeating colonialism and white supremacy in Southern Africa in particular. So that it's a long documentary. It's available on YouTube. It's called Amandla, A Revolution in Four-Part Harmony.
Amandla.
So Amandla, which means power to the people, right? So A Revolution in Four-Part Harmony. So it covers everything. So having fun is a form of is a revolutionary act when you are under oppression. Laughter is a revolutionary act. This is a huge topic, and I understood when I saw the choice of the theme of discussion. I was actually pleased that this kind of conversation is happening even in a place like the UK, where often I think, of course, we are witnessing changes now, and part of it is because of social media. People are linking up, with people from other parts of the world sharing experiences, and that is a good thing. So we are seeing, the impact of that in how the kind of questions people even in the UK are asking, especially young people, especially in the universities. And the future is orange. The future is very bright. So, so yes. But also, even when you look in the past, for Muslims in this room, that yes, the kind of creative arts you're talking about have always played an important part as a way of resisting oppression. Literary renewal literary renewal as social protest, or in poetry, for example, in the 9th century, you had the development of new poets, and they were positioned as a new movement against the past. It was characterized as the debate between the moderns and the ancients. I know in French literature, in recent few centuries ago, there was a similar movement. I'm talking about the 9th century. So this way back into the 9th century, centuries before the movement in France. And you had a similar movement, similar clash. And what you also see in the new poets, we call the muhdath poet, that's the Arabic term for them, was that they were resisting the system. So for them, literary renewal was a form of protest against the systems of power. Right.
Producing new literature.
Yes, so the production of new forms of expression against the old ones, because for centuries, from the time of the Prophet, the time of the Prophet anyway, they were living in that era, so they were celebrating the pre-Islamic past in terms of the literature and the forms of entertainment from the pre-Islamic past. And throughout the Umayyad period, the Umayyad wanted to link themselves in order to give themselves authority, they linked themselves to the past. They invoked the pre-Islamic past. They wanted to present themselves as authentic Arabs. So one of the ways of doing that was to reproduce ancient Arabic poetry. So throughout the Umayyad period, the only way of expressing yourself, if you were a poet, was through this ancient Arabic way of doing poetry. Until the 9th century, when you now had poets like Abu Nuwas, whom some people say he may have been gay, and many others, Abu Firas and many others, who now developed not just a new way also new language of doing poetry, a new style, and they were described as the muhdath poets, the modern poets, and the ancient ones were called the Qudama, or Asharul Qadim, the ancient poet. So works were written, even then works were written describing these two movements. And one movement is a protest. Now, if you read Abu Nuwas's poems, in the opening of them, you see that, how he's protesting against the imposition of the old ways on new people who live in a city like Baghdad or in Iraq. They live in urban cities. They are being told that the only way they can be seen as good poets is when they imitate a form of poetry produced by Bedouins living in the desert. So poetry innovation became a way of resisting. But this is in the 9th century. But for me, what is interesting is that this use of creative imagination as a form of protest can even be traced back to the pre-Islamic period. In Arabic literature, there was a poet called Antara, who was a black poet, one of the most famous of the Arabic poets produced in the history of Arabic literature. He is one of the authors of the 7 suspended poems. So in his Mu'allaka, the suspended poem, you read the opening part of it. It has been interpreted as a protest because he's calling for a renewal, it seems, of a literary renewal. And you read through the poem, he writes and resists against racism in this particular Mu'allaka, but he has other poems as well where he openly writes about anti-black racism. But his style is what has not yet been properly examined, is the use of his, especially the Mu'allaka as a form of protest. As a kind of literary renewal as a form of protest. And that has not been properly done, but we see it throughout the history of Muslim communities. But the most recent examples are the examples I've given you in Southern Africa in particular, where the the creative arts, the music, the performance, everything was at the heart. It was the anthem of the resistance against white supremacy. The documentary I told you, A Revolution in Four-Part Harmony, explains how it would have been maybe impossible to achieve those victories without the musicians. I agree. Yes, there were battles being fought in the forests, military battles, and then battles on the streets, people resisting, the police, and then also battles, intellectual battles, theological battles, theologians fighting over, the interpretation of text, one oppressive interpretation, the other liberative. So you had battles everywhere. Music was at the center of that, especially music. And films also, but because of the limited resources, people couldn't make a lot of films. But yes, poetry and music played a key role in that. So
let's throw it out to the audience, roving mics. I think we probably have about 10 more minutes we can squeeze out of this time. But does anyone have a question?
When you were talking about how scriptures and texts are embodied interpretations, so Naima will read it differently from you, for instance, and everyone comes with their own position when they're reading it. My question to that, and I'm always struggling with this aspect of hermeneutics of reading text, is that the text itself lends itself to certain interpretations more easily than other interpretations. So it does have a reality on its own, and it's not, at least I feel it's not infinitely flexible. You have to mute the text sometimes even. So when it comes to scripture and faith, when this is a text that that's foundational to your belief, it becomes even more difficult to mute it or to read it in different ways than what it's seeming like. So for instance, when I read, so this is my question more directly with your example of divorce and domestic abuse. Was it Khala when she complained and then the divorce laws were sort of revealed? Those two, when I read them, I question, were they gender equal? And the way that we have understood them, they don't seem to be gender equal. So the husband has a different right of divorce from the wife. She has to ask rather than give. So how much, when we want to reimagine justice, how much does text sometimes forbid certain lived experiences, and even if it goes against our conscience, do we have to go by the text because of faith? So that's kind of fun.
Okay.
Can I just, before you answer, can I ask if there are any more questions, and we can take a couple at a time? Stick your hands right up. Okay, so one just at the back, and then can we take Hassan in the middle?
Hi, just want to thank you so much for this lecture. It was amazing and really refreshing. I was just wondering, because obviously not everyone has the privilege to be directly involved with just, protesting. So I was just wondering, do you have any tips for personal style resistance, like just small things that we could do individually to make an impact, even if it's a small one?
Thank you. And Hassan?
Assalamu alaikum. Again, echoing everyone else, how moved or reflective that lecture made me. What I wanted to bring back to creativity, and is creative expression the ultimate form of sharing lived experience, and just maybe have a is creative expression the ultimate form of sharing lived experience in terms of striving for justice?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'm writing down so I don't forget.
So we've got a question on the text lending itself to certain interpretations. We've got a question on sort of everyday resistance that isn't necessarily within an organised movement, and a question on creativity being the ultimate way of understanding each other.
Yes. So because we're talking here about religious texts, and we're talking about, because religious texts are ancient texts, So these are the questions asked by people today, but they were also asked even by early readers, right? I think Ali bin Abi Talib, is recorded in Jalaluddin Suyuti's work and many others, is the first person to give us what you might call an expression of what really happens when you do hermeneutics. When he was during one of the Battle of Siffin, the army of Muawiyah raised copies of the Quran and said, let's resolve our conflict by going back to the Quran. And then Ali said to his followers, well, this copy of the Quran is a text between two covers, and it needs interpreters, and interpreters are human beings. Right? So we often read this, but we don't often realize the implications of what he's trying to say. And this is exactly the point, that interpreters are human beings. So because we're reading this text today, we're reading them, there's a gap between us, the readers, and the world of the text. And the texts themselves are encoded in the language of the audience. In order for the Quran to have any meaning to its audience, it has to be in the language of that audience. So it absorbs the patriarchal language of the readers, of the audience. It is in the language of the people. The Quran itself says so. It is revealed in the language of the people. What does language mean here? Does it simply mean communication, but also language as discourse? So it is encoded with all the things we should associate with that particular society. So when you're reading it in a different context, you have to understand that the process of interpreting a text is not just cross-linguistic, your ability to read Arabic. It's also cross-cultural, and you're also trying to understand a different culture and a different context, right? So it's not really a matter of just asking yourself, what is the text saying, but why is it saying these things in the way it is saying them? Why is it choosing these words to say this? Those are the important questions to ask, not what is it saying, but why is it saying these things and how is it saying them? What language is it using? You should spend most of your time looking into those things. And then that's where you'll see a lot of things unpacking, a lot of things start making sense, at least to me as a reader. I see that the text makes sense to me when I ask those questions, not what it is saying. Because what it is saying, it is addressing 7th century Arabs, right? I am living in London or Cambridge in the 21st century. So I'm not interested in those questions. I want to know, why is it saying these things and how is it saying them and what kind of language is used and why is this language used in the way that it is used? And those are the questions that matter. And then you can apply any question you have and you'll begin to see some of the, I don't know if I've answered your question on this, that the business of reading text really is not about whether the text lends itself more to one particular reading. Well, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, texts need interpreters. So you are deciding that it's most likely that this is the meaning of the text. It may not even be what the text is saying, right? So you have made the choice that you think this is the particular, or this is a more kind of plausible reading based on your own experience. You're drawing on your own experiences as a reader, your own history, and so forth and so on. So a lot of messy things happen when we read text, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. It's not a neat business. A lot of things happen when we read text. First, we are confronted with a text we believe is revealed by God, but we also believe it is revealed by God in the language of the people. We know what human beings do when they create language and meanings. We know that. So it already means that that particular text, and yet we also believe that God is unlimited in terms of his power and knowledge. And yet God is unlimited in terms of power and knowledge, but also God is choosing to convey the message in a language, in a limited language, our human language. Right? We are human beings, we create words, we create meanings, try to imagine something that has never existed and assign a name to it. It's impossible. So the names of the things we have and those that exist are referring to things that exist and so forth. So if the Quran is in this particular language, then it means it is limited by our language. So we don't have the kind of language to discuss these kind of... So when we understand this, and then we may understand what is going on when the text say... Then also there's the question of the audience, who are 7th century Arabs with the different customs and laws and their relationships, the different relationships between various sections of the community, and the text itself is asking this. So the text, sometimes it adopts the language of a community in order to defamiliarize that particular subject and to challenge us to look at this topic again, and sometimes maybe even using certain languages in a way that challenge us to rethink what we think we know about this particular. Nor is this more evident than in the areas to do with gender, for example, because our understanding of gender relations are really limited in that, and yet we understand that God's knowledge, the attributes are universal, but the topics that the Quran deal with are particular. They are not universal. There are topics in there which are universal, but when it comes to human interaction and relation, they are all particular. In terms of the specifics mentioned, there are issues and questions which are specific to 7th century Arabia, but the general message we draw from them may be universal. The concept of justice is a universal concept. But in terms of how we define and engage or establish, that may differ from context to context. A good reading of the text is one that is read from the here and now. You draw from your own experience. You ask yourself what the text is saying to you here and now, and do not try to become a prisoner of the past. Information and knowledge from the past is extremely important in informing your reading, but it shouldn't impose on your reading of that particular text.
So should we go to the next question?
Now, the first question was about how to contribute today, someone asked. There are a lot of things going on. We're not living in a perfect world. We have a situation now when food banks are running out of food during this Christmas. And yet, in some places, we are debating which carpet to buy for the mosque. And there are also cases where in churches, especially the prosperity gospel churches, they want to buy a pastor a new jet, and all these things are happening. But I can say that a lot of young people are probably doing more to bring about positive changes than the mosques and the churches. That's a fact. So the churches and the mosques have failed to address the kind of challenges that people are faced with and the kind of questions people are asking today. And that's a huge failure, not just in this country, in America and other parts of the world. So what can people do? They look into their own communities first. The Prophet said, start by those closest to you. Look into your community. If your local library is about to be closed down, then do something about it. And also your food banks, and also, there's so many things, depending on people's expertise and interests, there are a lot of things that people can do to contribute, in their own local communities without looking even global. And history is always about local stories. And, we're often seduced by the big stories of, wars and, victories. But history is about the local stories, often the stories that people don't get to write a lot about. And those are the stories that really matter. And also, as a Muslim, I would say, as the Prophet said, that, a good word is charity, being good to others. and not judging people on the basis of their race, their sexualities, and not to, to exclude people on the basis of that, and using, various mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion. The idea that, for example, people's sexualities are a choice is a way of excluding people. Because then when you say that, you are saying that it's justified to exclude someone from Islam if they are gay. What is a choice is iman. Faith is a choice. But it's not a choice to be gay, but it's a choice to be a mu'min, right? So these things, I mean, when we challenge some of these things in our own lives, we start with ourselves, and maybe that's the way forward, by starting with ourselves. And there was a question about creative expression, sharing lived experiences, whether, the creative expression are ways of sharing lived experiences. Yes, there are, but it also depends on, on individual cases. Because when we're speaking about someone exercising creative imaginations, not everyone is sharing their experience. Some people are simply being experimental. Some people are simply, trying to have fun, right? So, and this is an ancient debate from Plato's Republic on the function of the arts or poetry, whether they have a didactic function or not in society, whether they, whether simply, he was of the view that the good art, good poetry is the one in which people share their lived experiences based on reality, share their lived experiences. It is mimesis. It is based on people's lived experiences, and that is also the view that was adopted by Muslim scholars who were of the view that good works of art should really explore people's lived experiences. But we know that there are people who just want to be experimental. And this view has been a dominant view, and I have to say I subscribe to that view. I come from that tradition. In Africa, this is a huge debate whether writers, what was the role and function of writers in resisting colonialism. So those writers who were experimental were often looked at, with a great deal of suspicion, to say the least. For example, one famous writer, Dambozo Marechera, who faced a lot of criticism, and Wole Soyinka and others, because they were of the view that the role of the artist is to just experiment and do this sort of things. Others, Chinua Achebe and many others, were of the view that you have social responsibility, you have to contribute, you have to produce the work that challenge the status quo, right? So it depends where you position yourself in this debate, whether you think that your role as an artist, and I really do believe that, I subscribe to that sort of socialist view that you have a responsibility as an artist you don't have the luxury. I say so because even as an academic, I am also informed by this, that I don't have the luxury to sit down in my college library and only focus on an obscure topics that on subject that no one will be interested in. As a black scholar, I don't have that luxury that maybe a white scholar has, who can, write about potatoes in 9th century or something like that. And there are people who have actually done studies on that. So history of the potato. I don't have that luxury. I have to ask questions that others may not ask, because they are privileged in that they don't have to ask these questions. So as an artist, if you're a privileged artist, you can afford sometimes to be experimental, to do all sorts of things. But there are also cases in which being experimental is also a way of protesting and resisting an established definition of what art is, right? So it really depends on individual situations.
Thank you so much. I think we're about ready for lunch. Am I getting waved at? Yes, so Roberta's here from Masimas. She's going to tell us about the food we're going to have, and then we will usher you all into the hall to get something to eat. But thank you very much, Sheikh Michael Mumisa.